And we are back. We are the Coalition, loud and proud, outrage porn-free, civilly disobedient media, broadcasting as always on the Worldwide Coalition Media Network here at the Go Local Live Broadcast Center, deep in the heart of the city we love, Providence, Rhode Island, the naked city, the city of, I'm told, about 365,000 stories. We're going to talk about one of the most disturbing and compelling ones yet tonight. Facebook.com/The Coalition Radio, on the mighty Twitter at Coalition_radio, and of course the mothership at coalitionradio.us. Joining us in the 8 o'clock segment, the punk rock Libertarians. I'll just let that hang there. As someone who is actually old enough, who actually went to punk rock concerts, this I can't wait. But this is a very difficult week here in the city of Providence, Rhode Island. As I mentioned in the run-up to our first guest, a report was issued by the Johns Hopkins University School of Education that portrays the Providence school system. Normally, as someone who enjoys words, I would say in less than a flattering light. That would be perhaps the understatement of a generation. It portrays a school system that, on a physical plant level, is fundamentally broken, where rats, mold, water leakage, crumbling infrastructure is a part of every child's life. I'd be talking about a takeoff on that 1950s movie, The Classroom Jungle, but that seems almost like a parody to compare to how badly broken classroom disciplinary structure is. And of course, when we talk about curriculum, I'm not even sure if I can use the word curriculum in the same sentence with the terms Providence School Department. The cost, as someone who's been advocating against public education now for 20 or so years, is beyond financial. We have engaged in nothing less, in my words, than a generational educational holocaust here in the state of Rhode Island. And I mean every part of that. If someone finds that offensive, as someone who saw me or heard me say that on the Lively Experiment, about a month or so ago, oh well, I'm not here to be your friend. I'm here to tell you that the children in this state have been horribly deserved. We have lost a generation to children who, because of the failure of our leaders and our structure, our social structure, are functionally illiterate. I'm talking about classroom performance where 10% at times of the students in a particular class or area of study, according to the RICAS tests, which are essentially, for lack of a better term, a duplicate of the very successful MCAS tests, operate at a base functional level, understanding that in its first year of implementation, that notion that what constitutes a base functional level is a rather soft perspective. So in light of that, I and my libertarian friends and folks who believe in free enterprise and the free market and believe in self-determination, self-ownership, who believe that parents and the family structure should have the first level of control over someone's education, who believe in ending the Department of Education, returning education to its original roots, all of that have finally been freed up to say exactly what we mean. And in my personal case, I believe that we need to end public education. I am probably not the best provocateur for that statement. It's very emotional for me. I have had 2 daughters who've graduated college in the last 2 years. I am uniquely blessed. Their mom, the efforts of literally 12 years of private education, which cost us dearly, all made them superior students and perform at a very, very high level. I am blessed. This one scourge, and it is a scourge, I managed to avoid. So it's a very emotional issue for me, so I find it difficult to put into words. Yeah, imagine. Wow. So I'm turning to someone who I believe, and this to me is meant as a pure compliment, I believe is one of the philosopher kings, if you will, of the libertarian movement. He is the vice president of the Libertarian Radical Caucus. He is a constant presence and force amongst philosophical arguments, large and small, around the libertarian landscape. And I've asked Tarnell Brown to join us tonight to talk about Well, my term, and I'll let him explain his philosophy, but my term is simply to hashtag end public education. Tarnell, this is a very short notice. I am always as grateful for when we kind of have to break glass and add Tarnell. Kind of, it's like an emergency. There's an emergency panel in every libertarian household. Break glass, call Tarnell. There seems to be a bat phone or something. I'm not sure what the symbol across the sky is right now. It's still a little sunny out. We'll see it later tonight. It'll be, I don't know if it'll be a picture of you in a fedora, but there is almost weekly a universal call. Please call Tarnell Brown. Tarnell, help me out here. You know, why do we need to move away from public education?
Because the system has become fundamentally flawed, Pat. Can you hear me?
Perfectly.
We have a long, honored tradition of public education in America that started, if memory serves me correctly, in 1635 in Boston, in your area, in Boston, Massachusetts, Boston Latin. Okay, and in 1639, the Mather School was started in Dorchester, Massachusetts. The thing, colonial public schools prided themselves on local control. And that's what we've moved away from in our current paradigm. The local colonists, decided how much taxation would be spent for the schools, who the teachers would be, what the curriculum would be. They were intimately, ingrained into how these schools work. And we've moved away from that in a tremendous fashion. We are now standardized. Everything is one size fits all. We're teaching to the test. We are not preparing our students for the world. Just because you can pass a test doesn't mean you can go out and be a productive citizen. You know that as well as I do. Mm-hmm. I don't know what the standardized tests actually mean in real world terms. And this is the failure of public education, because everything is standardized. There's no innovation. There's no creativity. There is no wiggle room to teach students in the ways that they need to be taught. No two people are the same. Okay. If you were to place you or I in a higher mathematics class, I'm sure we could both pass, but we learn differently, and one of us would pick up on it faster than the other, correct?
Absolutely.
Okay.
You would.
So when you have these standardized classrooms, you're not able to reach out to students who learn slower or learn differently because you have all of these regulations that tell you how you have to teach a specific student. Let me give you some numbers. We spent a lot of money, okay? We spent at least $620 billion on K-12 in 2016. That's roughly $12,300 per student. And actually the number is higher than that. It's closer to $1 trillion when you get into hidden costs. But we spent $620 billion on K-12 education. And for that, we're getting reports from Johns Hopkins like what you're seeing in the Providence schools. I don't know any type of business in the free market that could exist on that type of return on investment.
None.
One of the things I think that we need to do, first and foremost, is get the federal government out of public education. That's the first thing we need to do. And I will give the current administration credit. They are making moves in that area. But I don't know if you realize this, but the federal government only provides 8.3% of all the funding for public schools in the United States.
Mm-hmm. Wow.
Okay. 8.3%. And for that 8.3%, they have taken total control of the standards for our public schools. Okay. If you ran a business and I gave you an 3.3% investment in your business, would you turn over control of that business to them?
No.
Okay. But that is what we've done with our public school system. Okay. We have all of these unfunded mandates and programs that, they're competing for this money. They're competing for this 8.3% on a state-by-state, location-by-location basis. And they have to fill federal mandates, many of which are unfunded. I mean, Pat, seriously, when they get the money, they've already spent more than what they're getting from the federal government.
Right. It's and we're talking about on everything from bizarre reimplementation and changes in curriculum to, invasive personal testing, invasive personal questioning, everything to do with really social engineering as opposed to, say, God forbid, the fundamentals of math, critical thinking, English, writing, any of those issues. It's absolutely terrible.
Right. This really began after the end of World War II, and I hate to blame baby boomers for everything. But until the end of World War II, the localization, the local control of public schools was seen as sacrosanct. The government was not going to get involved. But then you began to have these ideas. You've got the 1958 National Defense Education Act, which provides, support to science, math, foreign language, and a system of direct loans to college students. That's when the, student loans first started. And then you have the establishment of the Department of Education in the Carter administration.
Right.
That wrested even more control from local students. I don't think that some congressional aide in D.C. is aware of the needs of the students in Fulton County, Georgia. It's just as simple as that. They can't possibly be. It's just not feasible. And imagine that congressional aide now having influence over what happens in thousands of school districts across America.
It strikes
So that's
me. Yeah, no,
first thing that we need to do. We need to get back to local control of public schools before we even talk about the abolition thereof.
Is that possible?
Is that possible? I mean, we're libertarians. We don't really deal with what's possible. We deal with what's needed to be.
Right. You think?
If we dealt with what's possible, none of us would be libertarians.
That's we do live in our own little utopia, in our own little private Idaho, don't we?
But as far as is it possible, Congress passed the X. Congress can rescind the X. The executive department created the Department of Education. The executive department can dissolve the Department of Education. It's possible. Now, if it's going to happen, it's a different question.
Have we got to the point, in terms of, of course it's possible, where Eisenhower talked famously about the military-industrial complex. Should we be reserving that same type of fear, probably too late, but should we be speaking in those same awestruck terms when it comes to the educational industrial complex?
Of course. We are a nation of complexes. We all have a complex of some kind. And most of them are not of our own doing. The problem with public education, especially when you have standard, universal standards, is there's no competition. When there's no competition, there's no innovation. When there's no innovation, students are stuck in the mud. They are the victims of good intentions.
But it is I agree with you that the good intentions and the, and we all know about the road to hell.
Yes.
But at this point, have larger economic forces taken over? I often say that students are sort of a necessary inconvenience, necessary to perpetuate a school system which really exists largely for the consultants, the publishers, the unions. I mean,
there's a strong positive correlation between education and economic growth. We both know that. So, of course, we want our young to be educated. It's critical to our national interests. in so much as libertarians actually care about national interests. That said, that doesn't mean that it's the government's area. We don't really, they don't do anything particularly well, to be perfectly honest.
Right. What then are we to believe that, and I clearly eliminating the Department of Education federally could never be called a half measure. But is there any hope in some level of half measures? Can we expect an eventual relapse if we continue to allow government at any level into our school systems?
Of course. Anytime you allow the government to authority in any sector, it tends to grow. That's just the nature of government. Mm-hmm. It's never going to, of its own accord, restrict itself. What we need to do, this is what needs to happen, and I've said this, very many times, and I sometimes get arguments about it. We often say, as libertarians, that if there's demand, the market will provide. Mm-hmm. There is a demand. The market ain't providing. That's the problem. Okay. We are the market. So it's up to us to innovate. We've already discussed that education is needed for our young. It's in our interests. It helps economic growth. But we actually have to create alternatives that outstrip the government offerings, that make them irrelevant. It's as simple as that. And I know saying it's as simple as that doesn't necessarily mean that that's easy, but it's what has to happen. And so far, we are not doing that.
So essentially, you posit that while the government is probably not going to voluntarily step aside, that people essentially voting with their feet, with independent entrepreneurs providing alternatives, whether it be parochial, private, for-profit, whatever, are going to actually have to interject themselves into a highly codified, highly structured market for there to be any hope of change. Is that what you're saying?
Correct. If no one goes to the public school closes.
And certainly no one will be the worse.
No.
I mean,
Actually, you have a fully functional educational building that can be bought by a private corporation.
Yeah. For more than enough money to compensate the taxpayers, and perhaps we can leave the signs on so people will look at these as, they're the references to the community school and kind of chuckle and say, wow, can you believe people did that for so long? Can you believe people just let their children suffer in silence for so long?
Correct. And there are roadblocks in the way. I mean, there are regulations, there are laws, but the law, for the most part, says that up until a certain age, your son or daughter has to receive a certain level of education. And those are a discussion for another day. But that doesn't necessitate that your son or daughter goes to the public offering. Mm-hmm. Not everybody is qualified to homeschool their children. Good God, I don't want that to happen for some children. But again, there can be private alternatives. And this is the key, though, because not everybody is able to afford private alternatives. There has to be some sort of way that the people at the lowest end of the totem can also benefit from this as well. Mm-hmm. Because if that doesn't happen, then the government still has an excuse to maintain their monopoly. Mm-hmm. It doesn't go away.
Right. Well, and to that, there's plenty of at least anecdotal evidence that, I'll use the 19th century word charity schools, have been very, very successful. And the Nativity Project is one, led by the Jesuits. Mm-hmm. They're in cities across the nation, very high standards, very high graduation rate, almost perfect in many cities. very high, I'll call it progression to advanced education, not just college, but also in many cases to technical or vocational education.
Right.
And these are done at no cost to the students.
Right. And I think that private firms and corporations and trade organizations have an important role to play in the privatization of education. Now, are you familiar with the Lambda School?
No.
It is a school for coders. And basically, when you become a student at the Lambda School, you don't pay up front. You pay tuition after you've gotten a job making a certain amount of money in installments. And the reason they're able to do this is because they receive grant money and funding from companies like Google, Microsoft to help them write their curriculum. Private firms know what they're looking for.
Mm-hmm.
So we need to enlist them in our privatization of schools to prepare our students for life. I have absolutely no problem with Geoffrey Chaucer. I love him. Okay, but passing a student in high school based on his understanding of Chaucer is meaningless to me. How is that going to help him in life unless he becomes an English professor, which is an entirely different conversation as well?
Yeah. No, there's, in a perfect world, you should be able to balance curriculum that will generate skills in critical thinking and at the same time offer an opportunity for the teaching of the trades, teaching of a particular skill like accounting, law, medical functions, things like that. I'm not sure why it doesn't exist more, because I've seen it. My children's education was able to tackle both, and while it's a private school, the population of my children's school is very diverse ethnically. It's relatively diverse financially. It just speaks directly to driving children to higher levels of accomplishment.
Right. Somewhere between the 50s and the 70s, after we realized that there was a direct positive correlation between education and economic growth, the developed countries got into what was called the brain race, and everybody wanted their children to have a certain amount of education and go to college and whatnot. Here's the problem with that. Nations like Japan or Germany don't teach their children superfluous things in school.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. It's not necessarily standardized. It's not one size fits all. We're going to find out what your son or daughter is good at, and we're going to teach them that so that when they get out in the world, they can run with it. We don't do that. Mm-hmm. Okay? We want them to be able to pass a test that tells you absolutely nothing about their ability to function as an adult. So we are in the brain race, but we have put ourselves in a position where we are going to lose, which is why we are middle of the pack educationally among the developed countries, and we don't get why that's happening.
Mm-hmm. So what's the let's steal a page from our friends in Socialist Workers Paradise. What's the 5 and 10 year plan? What's the way forward, Tarnell?
Well, I'm going to begin this with a disclaimer. Mm-hmm. Central planning never works.
Right. Boy, do we know that here.
Because the central planners have to understand every single variable and every single want and desire of every single person within the market, which is not possible. But my 5 to 10 year plan, if there is such a thing, is again to return control of education to local school boards and to parents and to, counties and cities. Whatever relationship they have with their state education boards is up to them because, 10th Amendment, mm-hmm. That's their business anyway. Once we have gotten the federal government out of education and given local control back to the school boards, you're going to have more competition to see what is working in education and what isn't, because you have more innovation. And then private entrepreneurs can take a look at that and create better alternatives to do away with public schools altogether. That's my 5 to 10 year plan.
How low does the performance of our current public school system have to go before you see anything remotely resembling broad-based acceptance of that type of approach?
I don't know if it can go much lower. You know, you've heard me, Pat, say once that one of the reasons that I, advocate immigrants is that we need new blood because Americans are dumb. Mm-hmm. So I don't know how much lower it can go.
I know I popped this on you this evening. Read the Johns Hopkins report, and you'll see. And yet, the political class in this state, and this is a tiny state. I've got to believe we're roughly the size of Baltimore. I'll call it the greater Baltimore area. Still believes that they've got the moral authority to continue or to perform the necessary surgery on this school system to bring it up to some level of competency.
I'm going to tell you why that's never going to happen. Mm-hmm. Poorly educated populace does make good followers. We know that. Mm-hmm. Here's the problem. They're electing people to solve the problems that come from the same educational system they came from. Mm-hmm. How's that going to work out in the end?
It doesn't. No, it simply doesn't. It's literally the same gene pool. It's literally, in many cases, the same people.
Right.
Who are all shocked that there's gambling going on, / that their school systems have gotten so bad, yet these are people who occupy these halls every day as if this was happening in some sort of other dimension.
Right. The one-eyed man might have an advantage over his blind followers, but he still has problems seeing. And that's where we are.
Right.
Not just in education, in our system as a whole. Mm-hmm.
Do you, from your experience, and you're involved in education intimately, do you see the same problems where you live?
It's everywhere. It's universal. That's not to say there aren't superior public schools. Of course there are. But they're anomalies. They're outliers. Mm-hmm. I spoke about, Boston Latin and the Master School. They're great, of course, because they've been doing this since now 1635. Mm-hmm. But for the most part, there are, teachers are actually punished for trying to teach. They're punished for being creative. They're punished for recognizing that students learn differently and they need different attention at different times. They're not allowed to do that by regulations, by the 8.3% of federal funding that dictates the standards for everyone.
Do you see any forces within the political? Sorry, now we've just been treated to 2 days of endless debates, and for the sake of those folks who listen to this in the next few days, it is not lost on me, and I hope it is not lost on you, the irony of 10 to 11 people at a presidential debate, when in fact the Presidential Debate Commission will tell you that there should be no more than 2. So that when it's self-serving, then of course let's fill up the room with Democrats and Republicans. But that aside,
Pat, I didn't watch the debates. If I want to listen to a bunch of people yammer on about things they don't know anything about, I'll just go to the barbershop.
There you go. I mean, but then I'll answer my own question. From what I saw of the debates, I didn't hear a single mention, and please correct me if I'm wrong, folks who end up listening to this, I didn't hear a single mention of educational crisis. Those 2 words did not seem to appear in any sentences that I heard.
I haven't finished reading the transcripts because that's how I process these debates. I refuse to watch them, but I don't recall seeing any such thing either.
Right.
Honestly, the only major political force right now outside of the Libertarian Party depending on how major you want to consider us, that is tackling the education problem is Trump. I've got to give credit where credit is due.
What's happening there? Tell us.
He is working on legislation, and if he has to, he's willing to do it by executive order. We know that. That will take the Department of Education out of local school boards.
Mm-hmm.
Cutting the federal funding, the mandates, the regulations, and letting the local school boards figure it out for themselves without federal interference for 8.3% of their budget.
That's an awfully big section of government to take on. They can't be pleased.
Oh, of course they're not pleased, and he's meeting resistance, and he's going to meet resistance, not because Congress or the Department of Education actually thinks they're doing anything meaningful or correct. It means giving up power.
And a whole lot of money.
Yes.
This was where we're sitting right now here in Rhode Island. It was one of the districts that, and I'll use the coalition air quotes, won, as we refer it, the race to the bottom money a few years back. That was going to save education. And the commissioner at that time was quite effusive that upon the receipt of that money, that we would solve the world's problems. You and I know better.
Well, money doesn't solve problems.
I mean,
we have plenty of money in the education system. It's not money.
Yeah, it's and we know that. Most of that money, though, anecdotally, because no one's ever come up with a report that what happened, how did we do on our race to the bottom? Most of that money went to consultants. Most of that went to the...
Talked to a parent whose son went to a high school that literally had 12 administrators.
Huh.
Why does a high school need 12 different administrators? Most of those people have no clue what their job is, but assuming their average salary is $100,000 a year, we've got $1.2 million tied up in useless administrators. But the students had no books.
Sadly, that's
so
more
it's not
commonplace than you think.
It's not. But each of those administrators has to be there due to a specific law or regulation that requires their presence.
Huh.
This is the rabbit hole that we've walked down. This is the theater of the absurd that we're watching on stage. You have $1.2 million tied up in administrators, many of whom don't even know what their purpose in life is. But students in certain classes don't have books. Well, there's your book money. Fire the vice principal.
Buy a whole lot of books with $1 million.
Yes.
Even overpriced textbooks.
Yes, and I don't know that every school district in America is as bizarre a world as Atlanta Public Schools, but from my research, most aren't much better.
So you, again, as I prefaced in the opening remarks, you've got school systems for whom students are just sort of a necessary inconvenience in order to perpetuate the bureaucracy which serves so many, directly at the expense of said students.
Correct.
It is so upside down and so flip-flop. And I in some of my remarks this week out to my little social media following, I talked about that social compact. And we live under this quote-unquote social compact, and you're a philosopher, you know better, you can quote it better than I, but the implication...
I didn't sign a social contract.
I didn't either. I missed that day. I always miss class picture day, and I think I missed social compact day. Both for obvious reasons.
And interrupting you just one more time, Jefferson tried to tell us that, the particular social contract that his generation lived under was valid because they chose to live under it. But it was not valid for successive generations. Every generation should be able to freely associate in whatever type of governing form they choose to. He believes that the revolution was never over.
And yet, our leaders, elected and self-appointed, would tell you that they ended in, well, I don't know, by my estimates, somewhere around, what, 1943, 1944?
I mean, what was good for Thomas Jefferson and John Adams and George Washington and George Mason is not necessarily good for Patrick Ford and Tarnell Brown. Well, actually, what was good for Thomas Jefferson definitely wasn't good for Tarnell Brown in that time period for obvious reasons.
Yeah, I'm thinking that wouldn't have worked out well for you, buddy. You know, although, listen, I mean, I come from good, hardy, broke Irish stock. I mean, we're, you know, we certainly didn't face those challenges, but you know, it's not like America opened its arms and embraced us either. So.
Right,
and America still doesn't embrace you and I, so we're in no danger of that anytime soon. Hell, some days the Libertarian Party doesn't even embrace you and I. So what are you going to say to that?
Yeah, I mean, you know, your ancestors were immigrants, my ancestors were property. Let's pop open a beer.
Oh man, you're the best. Jesus. Let's go political for just a couple of minutes. What should the role of in the 2020 election? You're very active in the Kim Ruff campaign. I'm a big supporter of Kim Ruff. You and I have made no bones about that. How active? And this falls into what I call third rail politics. You know, conventional wisdom, of which you and I have no respect for whatsoever, has always said you don't discuss Social Security, you don't discuss public education. In my personal opinion, IMHO, right? Here in Rhode Island, those shackles have been cast off of me.
Well, Pat, we want to discuss third rail. Because the third rail is what keeps us in bondage because everyone's afraid to discuss it. We're going to discuss education. We're going to discuss Social Security. We're going to discuss immigration. We're going to discuss all the taboos. You remember the last time I was on your show when I said, I want people to be angry and bothered when I speak. I want people to be angry and bothered when my candidate speaks. Because when they're angry and bothered, they have been pushed out of their comfort level and their minds are now thinking. They might not have gotten to the point where they agree, but at least they're thinking.
Right. They're forced at some level comfortable truths.
Yes.
And admit to themselves that these are not attacks. They're not red flags. I guess that's the current word. They're not false flags. They are simply accurate representations of our current state of affairs.
Listen, Donald Trump ascended to the White House by tap dancing on the third rail.
Do you think we could take the White House by it?
He did it with demagoguery and outright untruths. We have a fiduciary duty to also exist on the uncomfortable edges, but we need to be shouting out the truth.
There's a quote, it's interesting, that I put on my Facebook page. And it's funny because most people don't take this quote. A cartoonist named John Callahan was a cartoonist of the Miami Herald back in the 80s. And
yeah, I'm from Miami. I'm familiar.
All right, so you'll hear this, and this is my representation. And one or two people have tried to use this as a quote-unquote literal presentation of my attitudes. And, you know, people who know me know that I am essentially a pacifist to a fault. But he quotes, "I'm happiest when I'm offensive. I have a desire to tear people in half. I want to move people out of the suburbs of their mind. I want them to suffer to feel something real. I have a lot of anger. I want to hurt people at least a little." is that type of, and I'll call that a psychological attack, on norms, on conventions, on status quo, on the accepted. Is that what we have to do now in order to save a generation?
Yes, I'll put it like this. Tarnell Brown quote. I don't care that you hate me, I only care that you're free to do so.
Give us that one more time.
I don't care that you hate me, I only care that you're free to do so.
No better words have ever been spoken on this show. It's the visceral reaction that we need to grab people to instill some type of reaction as to these issues is clearly missing from the body politic.
Well, look at history. Savonarola, Joan of Arc, Charlemagne, people that moved societies. None of these people made the people around them comfortable. None of them were afraid to offend. None of them were afraid to speak what they saw as the truth. None of them were interested in the lesser of however many evils.
Right. And that's why we have to run this presidential campaign like this.
Yes.
Because if not, you and I will be having the same conversation 4 to 8 years now. It won't be a happy recollection. It won't be a happy look back to what was. The circumstances will be even more dire. The consequences will have been greater. And the losses will have been equally or even more tragic. I say more tragic because these are losses that could have been avoided.
Yes.
And
we have to shake people out of the mindset that, I have to vote for X because Y is running. This is the most important election of our lifetime. Maybe we'll do third party later. That's a shell game.
right.
The only person that wins is the dealer.
It's interesting because Sarwark, to his credit, and folks, if you're not a libertarian, Mr. Nick Sarwark is the chairman, if you will, of the party. When approached in 2016 by said forces, essentially told them, yeah, I know, we've had that most important election in a lifetime argument before, and we've been told to step aside. This time will pass.
Every election is the most important election of your lifetime as long as you buy into elections, and I'll tell you why. Because you get to choose between status quo or something different. We keep choosing status quo as a nation. Therefore, guaranteeing that the cycle continues to perpetuate. I don't have any children, but if I did, at our current rate, my great-grandchildren would be talking about the most important election of their lifetime.
Yeah.
And as long as you can, as long as you choose between the Democrats and the Republicans who have no incentive, incentives matter in economics and politics, it's the same thing, just from different perspectives. They have no incentive to reform. They're in power.
In the first segment on the show, I had a gentleman on.
So what you get is the new boss, the same as the old boss.
Right. In the first segment of this show, we had a gentleman on from a national education advocacy organization, free market based, that had done extensive analysis a year after the now Janus versus Axby decision to understand what the impact had been on teachers unions and the degree with which the misinformation that still existed a year later, despite Janus being at the top of the news cycle for a month or so, despite all the debate and the noise about it, the fact that a preponderance of teachers still didn't understand their basic rights, their employment rights, vis-a-vis the union and the teaching contract under which they operate was stunning. Again, because there is no initiative, no market forces, and I'm not diminishing the efforts of this organization because they're working hard to turn this around, but market forces had still not been allowed to, to shine the spotlight to give folks the necessary information so they could make their own decision.
Well, as Robert Higgs often points out, when government is involved, when government is controlled, the costs are hidden. And when the costs are hidden, you don't get signals. So the information is skewed if available at all. And the government prefers to keep it that way. Because if the true cost of certain actions were known, there would be a civic revolt, not in the government's best interest.
All of
teachers, they join the union, they pay their dues, they feel that, their jobs are protected, and that's pretty much as much information as most of them know.
What's fascinating to me, this type of conversation, just even a few short months ago, perhaps in this case here locally, just a few short days ago, would have been dismissed as conspiracy talk, would have been dismissed as the fringe. But after reading this report, if anyone with a soul can walk away from this report and believe that government is acting in the best interest of the citizenry, when the travesties, the tragedies involved in this report are completely the product of, by, and for the government, then I'm not sure what I can say to you. If you could read this report and think that, as the cliche goes, the government is your friend and they're here to help, knowing that there were no external forces. Education in this society is a function almost exclusively of government. It is run by government people. It is mandated by government people. It is funded through coercive force of taxation, through the coercive theft of people's resources, with little or no opportunity to join in. It is a unique bubble. It is that geodesic dome. It is that boy in the bubble that can only exist by and for government. This should be proof positive to us, finally, to the folks who still believe that government has a role in, quote unquote, saving us. Who are you saving us, folks, from? Is government going to save us from government?
Well, I remember an older fellow once told me, and I adopted it as a saying of my own: you can never solve a problem with the problem.
I came up with a saying of my own, since we're comparing philosophies today. Tarnell, how do you define insanity to the insane?
The government's role, such as it exists, isn't to save anyone. It's simply to enforce the rights that we have naturally.
Right. As a self-described minarchist, and I'm a practical street politician, citizen activist, who has none of the training and the education that someone like yourself does, who mixes it with quite a background in being a street activist, by the way. I am ill-equipped, if you will, to challenge a lot of these issues. But what I am quick to point out is that ultimately government should exist to protect basic property rights.
You're not ill-equipped, and I'll tell you why you're not, Patrick. You have children that went to school.
Yep.
You pay taxes for this. Therefore, it is your right to challenge it.
And I might add, in this, somewhere Arvin might hear this someday, it would bring a tear to his eye. My children never spent a single day in theft school. 32 years combined education, not a single day in theft school.
Good for you.
And that's what, by the way, that's what we libertarians call public education. In case you weren't convinced we were completely on the edge. But again, there's vindication in this. So in a couple minutes we have left, how do we then, on a practical level, in your opinion, with heightened attention to this in different parts of the country, and we're entering a political cycle, what are the things that you suggest we should do as libertarians, and what manner should we deliver this information?
Well, I think part of our problem is we tend to want solutions for things on a macro level, which is there's nothing inherently wrong with that. But your child goes to X elementary school. Your focus needs to be on the district where your child goes to school, holding their feet to the fire. Making sure they're doing what they're supposed to do. Part of it begins with personal parental responsibility. Mm-hmm. Okay. If your local school isn't living up to your standards, why do they still have the same school board the next election cycle? Get rid of them. That's how you start that revolution on a local level. And again, we need private alternatives that will make that obsolete in the not too distant future. Maybe that will come from a group of angry parents.
I know a few of them that are listening tonight.
What was that, Pat?
I know a few of them that are listening tonight. I'm proud to say that Daryl Gould, an activist friend of mine who is a libertarian,
mm-hmm.
I guess I would call him a small L libertarian, but a pretty strong small L. It's a pretty bold, it's bold, italicized font number 16, in conjunction with a group of citizens forced to resign, a school superintendent who was running a school district completely out of control. Not the Providence one, the Bristol Warren. He and a group of other citizens took back the narrative from a school board that spent more time in an average meeting in quote-unquote executive session. And you don't need to be a parliamentarian to understand what that means. That means behind closed doors. And unfortunately, to contradict the song, we all know what goes on behind closed doors in school districts.
Right. Well, most school boards are completely out of control because, as I mentioned before, when government is involved, the true costs of operations are hidden.
Exactly. Which is why, on one hand, I present a political dichotomy. I aggressively support the use of radical policies in the 2020 presidential campaign because I believe it's important to whatever degree possible to deliver those policies in an articulate manner to hopefully a heightened, more aware electorate. But in reality, when it comes to the day-to-day battles of life, it is so important for libertarians to run for school board because ultimately, you've got a chance over time, if you're active and you follow a path of getting elected to it. But I remain convinced that the school boards and the town councils are where libertarians can literally change a generation.
Oh, definitely.
And Kara Schultz, to her eternal credit, in a not so small city in Minnesota, has managed to do that routinely. She's the perfect example of what can happen when someone who, as we say in New England, is wicked smart, who's tough, but at the same time uses a pragmatic approach to governing, which is she's intimately involved in changing how things are not done, not just preaching about it, but how they're done. When you get someone like that elected, you can change the world.
Yes, and you also will have public servants who value transparency, and the cost won't be hidden. They'll be out there for everyone to see. And you might have a situation where, as in Sandy Spring, Georgia, they found that most public services should be privatized because they're just more efficient and cheaper that way.
Absolutely.
Okay. And everyone within that location has a say in what private services are used by the city. Mm-hmm. If they're not doing the job, you just get rid of them. I mean, if you have a city sanitation department that's a government department and they're not doing the job, you can't just get rid of them.
Yeah, no,
but if waste management isn't doing the job, you just find someone else.
And therein lies the key. The notion that any of these services delivered by government are somehow a sacred part of the body politic is ridiculous. I doubt you would get said Jefferson to argue that it's critical that government, as part of its role, be responsible for sanitation. It's just not part of the mission. And to use that power to essentially draw into the government economy money and forces and resources out of the private market is highly damaging economically, and at the same time makes more and more people beholden to that of the power of government.
Well, that's because most of the job undertaken by government officials to justify government. It's not to serve any public purpose.
Absolutely.
When you're just simply trying to justify your existence, you're less than transparent. You're authoritarian. You're secretive. You enter into these back market deals. We are currently in Atlanta. We have 15 city blocks within downtown that need to be developed. And I'm for the development. It's just not sensible or feasible for a city of this size to have blighted, dangerous, drug-infested sections of our downtown. My issue is the lack of transparency in the process. I don't understand why the city of Atlanta has to pony up $2 billion to a private contractor to build these 15 city blocks. Sell it to them.
Yeah.
Outright. Let them develop it. They're going to make their money back and then some.
Let them do what they do.
There are 6 million people in the Atlanta metropolitan area. It's congested. A lot of them would love to move back into the city. There are a lot of people that can fit into a 15-block radius.
Mm-hmm.
They're going to make their money back. So why does it need to be subsidized? Why can't you tell me why you're subsidizing?
Right. And say anything happens here, it's the curse. And you know, and what's interesting is, and this is probably a subject for another day, because I need to keep this conversation going with you, is why is it that Republicans who believe in essentially free market believe that it's, quote, this is how things are done? They're not how things are done. They don't have to be how things are done.
Republicans don't believe in a free market. They give lip service to a free market.
All right, there you go. So I've got to wrap this hour up. And that, I think, is a great segue to when we get together again in a few weeks, because we need, as a party, to address head-on crony corporatism, understanding of truly what a free market means, what capitalism really represents, as opposed to the bastardized version that the duopoly presents to the American public every day. Based on what they present, it's no reason, there's no secret, no reason why they don't hate it. Of course they hate what is represented as capitalism to them. It's corrupt, it's cronyism, and it's remarkably ineffective. So I don't blame them.
Patrick?
Yes, sir.
The next time we do this, give me a few days heads up so we're just not, extemporaneous off the top of our heads.
No, this landed on my lap this morning, so God bless you, Tarnell Brown. Again, as the sky darkens here and night falls over Providence, there's a picture of an elegant man in a fedora that's appearing from a spotlight in the sky. And as usual, Tarnell Brown, you have graced us. You have made us better by your rhetorical presence. So I thank you very, very much.
And I thank you for having me on, Pat.
All right, buddy. And God bless Kim Ruff and John Phillips. Folks, we're going to take a quick break now. We are the Coalition, loud and proud, outrage porn free, civilly disobedient media, broadcasting live on the Worldwide Coalition Media Network here at the Go Local Live Broadcast Center. We're going to take a very quick break. Joining us in just a couple of minutes, Matt Bergman and the punk rock Libertarians are joining us. In the words of a great friend of mine, Tony Jones, we're going to scare the squares. Stay tuned. We'll be right back.